In January of 1962, probably the biggest mistake in music history occurred. No question, the biggest mistake in music history occurred in January of 1962. There was a British recording studio called Decca. And they rejected an audition that the Beatles had with them, stating that the group would never ever make it in music. So the Beatles decide, since Decca has rejected them, that they will record themselves. And the rest is history. Can you imagine the amount of money that this British recording studio called Decca lost by not being able to figure out that the Beatles were going to be probably the most recognizable and hottest musical group in the history of this country and maybe the world?
Well, like $1 billion.
Oh, I'd hate to guess. So British recording studio Decca in January of 1962 rejects the Beatles after an audition stating that the four would never make it in the music business. And after being rejected by the British recording studio, the Beatles decided to produce their own music, and the rest is history. Wow. Okay, February 4th of 1962. I'll preface this by explaining something to you that you don't really need to write down. I think you'll get it. When Jackie Kennedy became First Lady, she was very concerned about the old-fashionedness, so to speak, of the White House, how it not had been restored or really kept up very well during the previous, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower years. So she got the okay from Congress and spent a lot of taxpayer money restoring the White House, and took a little bit of grief about it. So she decided to use this great thing we have called television, and she led millions of viewers on national television on a tour of the White House, showing the country what she had done concerning the restoration of that particular building. It was an hour-long program, and it was carried by both CBS and NBC, and it was entitled A Tour of the White House with Mrs. John F. Kennedy. A Tour of the White House by Mrs. John F. Kennedy. And I'll show you footage of that when we get done with the lecture. It's kind of interesting because she took an hour-long program on national television, had two of the top TV stations broadcasting this live, and she simply took the entire nation, millions of people, through the White House that she had restored. Okay, very, very famous program of the time. That was February 4th of 1962. On February 26th, we talked about this a little bit, John Glenn Jr. was honored with a parade in Washington, D.C. Did I say June? No, February 26th, John Glenn Jr. was honored with a parade in Washington, D.C., and the parade traveled up Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House to the Capitol, where he addressed Congress about his fabulous feat of being the first American to orbit the Earth. So on the 26th of February, 1962, John Glenn Jr. was honored with a parade in Washington, D.C., and that parade traveled up Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House to the Capitol, where he addressed Congress. All right, this is pretty interesting. March 2nd, 1962. On March 2nd of 1962, the Philadelphia Warriors defeated the New York Knicks in an NBA game 169 to 147, one of the highest scoring games in NBA history. On March 2nd, 1962, the Philadelphia Warriors defeated the New York Knicks in an NBA basketball game 169 to 147. Pretty high scoring, one of the most high scoring games in NBA history. The thing that was more remarkable than the amount of points that was scored in the game was that one player on the Philadelphia Warriors team, a guy by the name of Wilt Chamberlain, scored 100 points in the game. Still an NBA record. Didn't have the three-pointer in those days either, kiddos. You know, Klay Thompson goes for 14 14 threes the other night for Golden State, finishes with a mere 50. By the way, in this season of 1962, Wilt Chamberlain averaged 50-plus points per game and 22 rebounds per game.
Okay, and in the defense of the NBA players today, they have a 3-second rule now.
No, he had a 3-second. He did.
What?
Oh yeah, George Mikan, that played for the Minneapolis Lakers, was the big tall man. He was the reason there was a 3-second lane when Wilt Chamberlain played. So
Okay,
don't get your
Wilt
stats
Chamberlain was
back.
also like the only big man of that.
Well, he was 7'1".
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you statistics in this game while Ryland's knocking him around a little bit. He only scored 100. Okay.
Kobe's 80.
Here, field goals from the field, basketball people. Field goals from the field. He shot 63 shots in the game. And he made 36, so he shot almost 52% from the field. So he's 36 for 63 from the field, right?
Yeah.
And he's 28 for 32 from the free throw line. So he shoots like almost 88% from the free throw line. And he's 7'1". So he's, whether you write this down or not, I don't care, but just listen. 36 out of 63 from the field, 28 out of 32. Here is his scoring each quarter. He had 23 the first quarter. And then he slacked down. He only had 18 the second quarter. But he popped back with 28 in the third and 31 in the fourth for 100. That's all, just 100 is all right. The guy averaged 50-plus points per game for the season and over 22 rebounds. So his quarter scoring, if you care, 23 in the first quarter, 18 in the second, 28 in the third, and he scored 31 points in the fourth quarter, okay, for 100. The second leading scorer on both teams for the night was Al Attles, and he scored 17. So he scores 100 of 169. The second highest scorer in the game scores 17. That was Al Attles, who was actually his teammate in this particular game. But 100. Here's a picture of Wilt Chamberlain right here holding up the 100 sign autograph picture, one of my treasures. He's dead now, he doesn't sign much obviously, but that's a unique signature. Wilt Chamberlain. Alright, April 22nd. According to historians, on April 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy was at the height of his popularity, which means he was never as popular after April 23rd, nor before April 22nd, excuse me, of 62. That was the height of his popularity. He was most popular at that time in history. And why was he so popular? Well, let me give you 3 reasons and then show you some pictures. One, you don't have to write these down, but one example of his popularity would be seeing his 18-month-old son, John, and his 4-year-old daughter playing in the Oval Office. That never happened before during the Truman administration, or the Roosevelt administration, or the Eisenhower administration. The entire Kennedy family playing football at their summer home in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. That was a big thing that was broadcast on TV. JFK at the helm of his boat, wind streaming through his hair, with these incredibly nice-looking Ray-Ban glasses that he was famous for wearing.
Oh my God.
They look alike? These actually are a pair of JFK's sunglasses that a big-time collector friend of mine, Harry McCormick, sent me many years ago. Now, I don't know if JFK ever wore these in his life, but they definitely belong to him. But they do look pretty similar, don't they? Yeah. Anyway, let me give you other examples. Here just, this is a 1989 calendar. This was how many years after his death? But we still put this stuff out. Here's examples of why he was so popular. Because he was in, let me preface this by saying, he was the first to hire a photographer. Cecil Stout was the official White House photographer, although he never had a title, but he was the one that took all these pictures. Okay, here's a picture of the family. Isn't that a nice picture? People really drew to that type of a picture. Here's a picture of the president at his desk. Okay, he brought Cecil Stout in to take these type of PR pictures. Here's the president and his wife all dressed up. In this particular time, they're in Mexico City, Mexico, making a visit. Okay, here's another picture of the president signing a bill at his desk with a big smile on his face and smile on the people behind him. Evidently they're happy with his move there. Okay, here is a picture of the president. According to this, it's a state dinner in honor of the president of the Ivory Coast. But they're all looking good, slicked up, a nice young wife, beautiful wife, handsome president. Here's the picture we already showed you. Here's a picture of the family at the summer home in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. These are not only his children, but Bobby's children, the other Kennedy boys' family. Secret Service there. Here's another famous picture. This actually was taken just shortly before his assassination, to be quite frank with you, that picture was. Here's a picture of him, and this shows how open he was to the American public, how he would allow the public to get close to him, which is going to cost him his life in Dallas in 1963 in the motorcade. Here's another picture of him giving an address at the University of North Carolina, which he did often. He would often go to colleges and give commencement addresses. Here's another picture of him at Union Station waiting for the Emperor of Ethiopia. Union Station is someplace we'll visit. It's a railroad station near the capital area. Okay, and then here's obviously the First Lady and the President at Christmas by the White House Christmas tree. These are the type of things and reasons why he was so popular. And we're still doing this in 1989. And I'll bet you, if we went into the mall, Rimrock Mall in Billings, they have those calendar stands, you see them all the time in there. I'll bet you anything you could find a Kennedy calendar.
So you said like you had that speech at North Carolina. Did you ever listen to Michael Bloomberg's speech in North Carolina when he said the roof is the sea? And he tried to make it out to like there's no windows because the roof is the sea.
The roof is a sea?
Yeah, there's like so many movies now. So.
Well, people will sure pay attention to that, won't they? Yeah. All right, moving on. May 19th. This is going to get a hair off color. I hope you can handle it. May 19th. Well, on the anniversary of your graduation was the day that Marilyn Monroe made her most famous performance. On May 19th, 1962, actress and probably top sex symbol of the time, Marilyn Monroe gave her most famous performance. She had been invited to sing Happy Birthday to President Kennedy on his 45th birthday, which was scheduled at Madison Square Garden in New York. You couldn't find a more public venue. But they had planned a 45th birthday celebration for the president at Madison Square Garden. And the man who chose Marilyn Monroe as the focal point of the birthday celebration was a fellow by the name of Richard Adler. Here's a picture of Richard Adler up here, then in later years. He was the man that scheduled events at Madison Square Garden. That was his job. And when he heard the president was coming, he thought it would be a nice touch, I guess, to have Marilyn Monroe sing Happy Birthday to the president. And again, he was the chairman of events at Madison Square Garden. Now, there was a little concern within the Kennedy administration, his aides, his cabinet members, Kenneth O'Donnell, David Powers, Lawrence O'Brien, Bobby, about her appearance because the rumors had been circulating that her and the president might be an item, if you know what I mean. And so there were a lot of concern within the Kennedy administration about her appearance. And she was scheduled to wear, and write down what you want here, she was scheduled to wear a very seductive nude-colored gown. And it was so tight that when they made it, they sewed it on her body. They didn't like make it and she put it on. They sewed it on her body. Now this dress cost $12,000 to make in 1962. And I'll show you a picture of it here. It sold for $1.3 million at an auction at Sotheby's in 1999. Here's a picture of the dress, here's a picture of the dress and her at the podium getting ready to sing Happy Birthday. This was like a really crazy deal. Well anyway, early in the morning on May 19th, Richard Adler is kind of having second thoughts about having her come. He's thinking about canceling her appearance because he's kind of concerned about the image it might portray and the things that were being said. And so what do you do when you're trying to make a decision? Who might you call to get their opinion? If I'm going to make a decision, I'll call a friend of mine. So he calls a friend of his, a guy by the name of Jack Benny. Now let me tell you a little bit about Jack Benny. Jack Benny was an entertainer himself. He was kind of like Johnny Carson, or kind of like Jay Leno, or who's Jimmy Fallon. He was that type of guy. He had a show like that in which it was a little bit of comedy. He'd stand up, give some comedy, and he'd have guests. He was kind of a famous talk show host at the time. And so Adler calls him and he says, "Hey Jack, what do you think about having Marilyn Monroe come to Madison Square Garden during this event and sing to the president?" This was his quote. Obviously you don't have to write down. He said, Get somebody else. What kind of schmuck are you anyway, getting Marilyn Monroe to sing happy birthday to the President of the United States? So, you know, Jack Benny's telling his friend, this is really not very bright. What kind of a schmuck are you? So Adler gets kind of concerned, and so who does he call next to see if he really wants Monroe there? Calls President Kennedy. Okay, so he makes a phone call to the White House to get President Kennedy's opinion on the matter. Kennedy listens to what Adler has planned, and he says, quote, his name is Richard, he says, believe me, Dick, it'll be all right. Believe me, Dick, it'll be all right. So he's giving Adler permission to bring Marilyn Monroe aboard. Now, why would he do that? Well, you've got to remember, in President Kennedy's mind, the appearance of America's first sex goddess would validate his presidency as the most swinging White House ever. I mean, they had a lot of celebrity supporters. He used to go to Hollywood all the time with Frank Sinatra and his brother-in-law, Peter Lawford. And Peter Lawford married Patricia Kennedy, and he was part of the Joey Bishop, Sammy Davis Jr., Frank Sinatra, Peter Lawford. They were known in Vegas as the Rat Pack. And they performed in Vegas, and they were kind of a wild crew, to be quite honest with you. Well, Peter Lawford was part of that. But anyway, the president gives the okay, and if you talk to biographers of Jackie Kennedy later, they all were consistent in saying what the First Lady's feelings were about the appearance of Marilyn Monroe. Anybody that did a biography on Jackie Kennedy said the same thing. When she found out about the fact that Marilyn Monroe was going to sing happy birthday to her husband, she gave her husband an ultimatum. If Marilyn Monroe shows up for this particular event and sings happy birthday to you, I will not attend. She gave him the ultimatum. It's Marilyn Monroe or me. So he got the news, and when he made his choice, the First Lady quietly excused herself from the ceremony. Okay? So picture this in your mind. Again, I don't care how much of this you write down, as you know who these guys on the ID sheet are, but picture in your mind, we're at Madison Square Garden in New York City. There are more than 20,000 Democratic supporters of the president watching in anticipation. At center stage steps up Peter Lawford, the president's brother-in-law, member of the Rat Pack, Las Vegas entertainer, gives a real drawn-out, sappy introduction where he says, and here's Marilyn Monroe, and she doesn't come in there, and then he says something else, and he kind of mocks the president, how he says things, and then she doesn't come out, and then finally she walks out kind of unintroduced, and he goes, ladies and gentlemen, the late Marilyn Monroe, because she's late, and she is hopped up, I think, probably on amphetamines and everything else, and the rest is history. I would just say that. Now, when Monroe got done performing, President Kennedy was introduced to speak, and this is what he said in reaction to the happy birthday. He said, "Thank you. I can now retire from politics after having had happy birthday sung to me in such a sweet and wholesome way." Again, a little bit of sarcastic Kennedy wit, and then he went on to give his speech. But it was quite a show, kiddos, quite a show. Now I'm going to read from a book here. It's a little bit off color, but this is a book on Marilyn. It's called The Last Take, Marilyn Monroe. It's a very famous book that was written many years after her death. And I'm just going to read a little passage here, and bear with me, but this is kind of how it was perceived across the country. He watched the actress move deliberately into the light, cutting short Lawford's sappy monologue, and just as Lawford said, "Mr. President, never in the history of the world has one woman meant so much," a gasp that built into a roar greeted Monroe as she danced through the circles of light. She coyly clasped the wrap around her, masking the dress beneath. She paused until the roar quieted, then shrugged out of the fur, letting it fall backward into Lawford's hands. Whistles and shrieks followed. Up in the presidential box, John Kennedy looked over his shoulder at writer Gene Shores and said, "Jesus Christ, look at that dress." Shore noticed that the president was staring at every move. Just behind the president in the director's control booth, Richard Adler took a long look at the transparent dress. "It was everything I feared," he said. Just before showtime, he had received a last-minute flurry of calls protesting Monroe's appearance. Some came from cabinet members, one from a senior member of the president's White House staff, and some from the highest levels of the Pentagon. As she began the first husky chorus, Monroe seemed energized, perhaps from the amphetamines prescribed by studio doctors. Robert Slatzer remembered that she was also pumped up with megavitamins and antibiotics. The effect was just hair-raising. It was so beautiful, said Ralph Roberts, who saw the performance from the VIP box. You couldn't hear yourself think for the screaming and yelling. It was like a mass seduction, Adler recalled, with Marilyn whispering happy birthday and the crowd yelling and screaming for her. I realized then that the president was a much better showman than I was. Monroe later told Life magazine that the approval of the crowd was like an embrace. Then I thought, by God, I'll sing this song if it's the last thing I ever do, and I did it for the people as well. I remember when I turned to the microphone, I looked all the way up into the stands and thought, that's where I'd like to be, way up under those rafters. The dress and the occasion would etch themselves into history of the Kennedy years, along with other film flashes of Camelot. JFK hatless at his inauguration, Jacqueline Kennedy arriving in Paris, which we'll talk about, John John's salute to his father's coffin after the assassination, which we'll talk about. Monroe's performance has been playing ever since. It just never goes away. Everybody knows when you say happy birthday, Mr. President, what you're talking about. It was unbelievable, and I'll show you on video a little bit later. Okay? All right, we'll move into June. June 25th. It was on this date that the Supreme Court banned official prayer in public schools. On June 25th, the Supreme Court banned official prayer in public schools. Making what the rule? The separation of church and state as we know it today.